This is a story about a small farming settlement on the Attic plain, nestled against the lower slopes of Mount Parnes in the autumn of the year we would call 415 BCE, and about the ordinary people who lived there during the olive harvest, a mother-in-law and a young wife learning to share a hearth, a patient man who could read the quality of oil by its color, a woman whose hands remembered 60 years of sorting, and a charcoal burner who came down from the mountain smelling of smoke. It is a story about the weeks when the whole world smelled of olives, and every household turned its courtyard into a workshop, and the goddess Athena's ancient gift passed once more from branch to basket to press to flame. But it begins in the dark, with a woman and a fire. Phanagora wakes without opening her eyes. She has no need of sight for this. The first passage of her day, the 12 steps from the low wooden bed to the hearth at the center of the courtyard, a path her bare feet have traced for more years than she can easily count, until the packed earth holds the memory of her souls as surely as she holds the memory of the earth. She rises. The air is cold on her arms, cold in the way of late autumn before the sun has even considered the horizon, when the stones of the house give back the chill they have gathered through the night. She pulls her wool blanket around her shoulders and walks. The courtyard is not dark exactly. It is the hour before dawn, and the sky above the open roof holds a faint gray luminance, the barest suggestion that somewhere beyond the mountains to the east the world is preparing to remember what light is. By this almost light, the courtyard takes its dimmest shape around her. The stone lip of the well, the bulk of the loom standing beneath its cloth cover, the low dark mouths of the storeroom doorways, and at the center, the hearth. The banked coals beneath their blanket of ash still hold a faint warmth that Phanagora can feel against her shins as she kneels. She rakes the ash back with a clay paddle, carefully as though uncovering something sleeping. Beneath the gray crust, the coals glow, deep ember red, the color of something alive and patient. She has never once, in all those years, let this fire die. To let the hearth go cold would be more than inconvenience. It would be a kind of abandonment. Hestia lives here, not in a temple on a hill, not in a marble statue with painted eyes, but here, in this specific fire, in this ordinary hearth, in the center of this house. Hestia has no face, no image, no priest. She asks for nothing elaborate. She asks only that the fire be kept, and that the first portion of every meal be offered to the flame, and that the family remember, in the first gesture of every morning and the last gesture of every night, that the warmth at the center of their home is not merely warmth. It is a covenant. It is the presence of the divine in its most quiet and domestic form. Phanagora has kept this covenant since the day she was carried across this threshold as a bride of 17, led to the hearth by her new husband's family, presented to the flame that would become hers to tend. She adds kindling now, dry twigs, a handful of olive wood shavings saved from Philon's workshop, their edges curling in the heat before they catch. She bends low and breathes across the coals. Not a forceful breath, a slow, steady offering of air, like blowing across the surface of hot broth to cool it, except that here the purpose is reversed. She is giving warmth to warmth. She is coaxing the flame up from its sleep, and it comes, a thin tongue of orange that licks along the edge of a shaving, then another, then a small bright flowering that sends the first light of the day flickering across the courtyard stones and up the plastered walls. The fire finds its voice, the soft crackle of catching wood, the whisper of heat rising. The courtyard begins to exist around it, surfaces emerging from shadow, the altar to Zeus Hercaeus near the low stone fence at the courtyard's edge, where Phanagora will place a portion of this morning's bread, the Pythoi visible through the storeroom doorway, their wide clay mouths stoppered with wooden lids, holding last season's grain and oil, and the dried figs that will sweeten the winter months. The well-worn stone of the mortar, waiting near the kitchen threshold for the day's first grinding. The smell of the courtyard at this hour is a thing unto itself, charcoal smoke rising from the fresh-caught fire, the residual sweetness of olive oil that permeates every surface from last night's lamp, the mineral coolness of stone and earth not yet warmed by the sun, and beneath it all, faint but unmistakable, the scent of the season itself drifting down from the groves on the hillside above, the dusty green, slightly bitter fragrance of olives ripening on 10,000 branches. The sound comes next, from the kitchen doorway, not a voice, a rhythm, the deep, steady percussion of stone on stone, a grinding that starts soft and finds its pace. Thrata has risen. She moves to the mortar as Phanagora moves to the hearth, by the body's knowledge, without consultation or instruction. She kneels at the stone bowl and begins grinding barley, the first handful of grain that will become the day's bread, the maza that is the foundation of every meal. The barley yields to the pestle in a low rasping murmur, releasing its pale dust into the bowl, and this sound joins the crackle of the fire to form the two-voiced music of the household's waking, flame and stone, Phanagora and Thrata, the woman who tends the sacred fire and the woman who grinds the grain, working in the near dark, in the near silence, in a coordination so deeply practiced it requires no speech. They do not greet each other. They do not need to. The morning has its own grammar, and both women are fluent in it. Phanagora feeds the fire a slightly larger piece of wood, olive wood, dense and slow burning, which will hold its heat through the baking. Thrata adjusts her grip on the pestle and leans into the stroke. The barley flour accumulates in the bowl, fine and pale as dust from the road. Outside the courtyard walls, the settlement is still sleeping. A dog barks somewhere, once, and falls silent. The narrow street beyond the house's blank exterior wall holds only darkness and the faint, sharp smell of someone else's hearth smoke. Another household, another woman, another fire tended in the pre-dawn dark. Above the roofline, the sky is shifting now, the gray deepening towards something that is almost, not quite, blue. But inside these walls, the day has already begun. The fire burns, the grain gives way to the stone, and in the growing warmth of the courtyard, the household's life begins to stir, drawn upward from sleep by the smell of smoke and the quiet, ceaseless rhythm of the mortar, the way the world itself is drawn upward from darkness by the slow approach of the sun. Dawn does not arrive all at once in a courtyard house. It comes in stages, like water filling a basin. First, a pale wash along the upper edges of the eastern wall, then a slow descent as the light finds the plaster, the stone, the packed earth of the floor, until finally the whole open square of sky above the courtyard brightens into the soft, diffuse glow of an autumn morning in Attica. The courtyard catches this light and holds it, distributes it into the rooms that open off its four sides like cupped hands receiving something offered. This is why the house is built the way it is, turned inward, its blank mud-brick walls presenting nothing to the narrow street, its windows small and high and shuttered with rough-cut wood, its life oriented entirely toward this open interior space where light and air and the presence of the gods converge. From the outside, walking along the lane between houses, you would see very little. A plastered wall, a wooden door, a stone threshold worn smooth by years of feet crossing it. You would hear the loom. You would smell the smoke. But the house keeps its life inside, held close as an unspoken thought. By the time the light reaches the courtyard floor, Phanagora has already baked the morning bread. The maza, flat, dense, faintly nutty from the barley, sits on a coarse clay plate near the hearth, its surface still warm. She has drizzled it with olive oil from a small lekathos kept near the cooking fire, the oil pooling in the bread's uneven surface, catching the firelight in tiny amber mirrors. A clay dish of honey stands beside it, dark and thick, brought up from the storeroom where it lives in a sealed vessel alongside the household's dwindling store of last year's oil. This year's oil has not yet been pressed. The olives are still in the grove, still on the branches, still waiting for Philon's hands and the slow machinery of the press. But the honey is here, and the bread is here, and the fire that baked it still burns with the steady orange patience of olive wood. And this is enough. This is what morning looks like, every morning in this house and in 1,000 houses like it across the deme. Thalia comes down from the upper floor. The stairway is narrow, built against the interior wall, its wooden steps creaking with a sound the household knows as well as they know each other's voices. Thalia descends carefully. The steps are steep, and the upper floor is dim, the small high windows admitting only threads of light that do little to illuminate the passage. The Geniaconitis above is where she and Nikon sleep, in a room that is also, at different hours, a storage space for clothing chests and folded textiles and the smaller household goods that migrate upward when the courtyard is full of work. The room has no fixed purpose. None of the rooms do, not really. The house breathes and shifts around the activities of its inhabitants, the same space serving as bedroom and workroom and storeroom as the day's needs require. Only the andron has a singular identity, and even that room stands empty most days, its mosaic floor and painted walls and raised couch border waiting for the occasions that justify its decoration. Thalia enters the courtyard and finds what she expected to find. The fire already burning well, the barley already ground, the bread already baked and glistening with its skin of oil. Phanagora is at the hearth, not resting but attending, the way she attends to everything in this household, with a quality of presence that is both practical and complete, as though tending the fire were a task that required her whole attention and always would, no matter how many thousands of mornings she had performed it. Thrata is rinsing the mortar at the well, the wet stone catching the early light, the water darkening the packed earth where it splashes. Thalia pauses at the edge of the courtyard just for a moment in the shadow of the stairway. She takes in the scene, the two women, the fire, the bread, the quiet efficiency of a morning that was fully underway before she opened her eyes. Then she steps forward and finds her place in the rhythm. She moves to the bread, begins to shape the remaining dough into smaller portions for the midday meal. Her hands know this work. She's been making bread since she was a girl in her father's house, in a kitchen that smelled of different smoke from a hearth tended by a different woman. She is not incapable. She is not slow. But the rhythm was set before she arrived, and she enters it as a musician joins a song already being sung, listening first, matching her tempo to what already exists, finding the spaces between the established beats where her contribution can fit without disrupting the whole. Phanagora does not look up from the fire, but the quality of her attention shifts almost imperceptibly to include the younger woman's presence, an unconscious adjustment, like a body moving around a familiar piece of furniture without deciding to. Thalia is a presence in Phanagora's household now, a reality to be accounted for, and Phanagora accounts for everything. The hearth receives its first offering. Phanagora tears a piece of the fresh bread, a small piece, but the first piece, always the first, and lays it on the coals. The bread darkens, curls, releases a thin thread of smoke that rises straight up through the still air of the courtyard. She follows it with a drizzle of oil from the lekithos, and the oil catches flame for an instant, a brief, bright flare that smells of everything this household depends on, the grove, the press, the goddess's gift. This is for Hestia, first and last, always, the first portion of the first meal, the last libation of the evening. The fire receives it as fire always receives what is offered, completely, without remainder, transforming substance into smoke and sending it upward toward whatever listens. Then Phanagora rises and carries a small clay dish, bread, oil, a few drops of wine, across the courtyard to the stone altar that stands near the fence wall. This altar is modest, a simple squared stone with a slightly hollowed top weathered by decades of offerings. It belongs to Zeus Herkaios, the guardian of the enclosure, the protector of the boundary between this household's world and everything beyond it. The word itself, Herkaios, comes from the fence, the Herkos, and the god inhabits the boundary as Hestia inhabits the flame. To ask where your house is in this world is to ask where your Zeus Herkaios stands. Phanagora places the offering on the stone, murmurs something too quiet for anyone else to hear, and returns to the hearth. These gestures are part of the meal preparation, not separate from it. They are as much a part of making breakfast as grinding the barley or stoking the fire. The gods eat when the household eats. This is simply how it is. Through the morning, as the women work and the courtyard brightens, the house reveals itself in pieces. You might picture it now as the light finds it, not all at once, but room by room, the way Phanagora herself would show it to you, with a kind of proprietary precision. Here, through the doorway, the storeroom, dim and cool, built for preservation, its great pithoi, the massive ceramic storage jars, sunk into the earthen floor so that only their wide mouths rise above the surface. There are 4 of them, each large enough that a child could curl inside. They hold grain, olives, wine, oil, the provisions that sustain the household between harvests. Phanagora knows their contents the way a person knows the contents of their own pockets, by feel, by weight, by the sound of a hand tapped against the clay wall to judge how full or empty the vessel is. The grain in the largest pithos is enough for perhaps a month, maybe 6 weeks if the bread is stretched thin. This is not a wealthy household. They are not the plausioi who do not need to work. They are the penets, the working people, the families who depend on the labor of every member and the yield of every harvest to carry them through to the next one. Here, the kitchen, small, dark, dominated by the cooking hearth and the smoke hole cut through the roof above it, the coarse clay pots, a kitra for boiling, a lopas for stewing, a teganon for frying, hang on pegs driven into the wall or sit on the stone ledge beside the fire. A large stone mortar and pestle stand near the doorway, where Thrata was working an hour ago. The walls are darkened by years of smoke, the plaster stained to a deep amber brown that no amount of cleaning will restore. There is a smell in this room that never leaves, charcoal and animal fat and the ghost of 10,000 meals cooked over more than 3 decades. And here, visible through the courtyard's widest doorway, the andron, the men's dining room, the one room in the house built for display rather than function. Its floor is paved with a mosaic of colored pebbles set in a geometric pattern, interlocking diamonds in black and white and terracotta red, the work of a craftsman hired by Philon's father when the house was built. The walls are plastered and painted in 3 horizontal bands, red at the base, yellow in the middle, white above, separated by incised lines, the standard decoration of a respectable household. A raised border runs along the walls where the dining couches, the klinai, would be placed during a symposium, their wooden frames lifted on legs about 1 meter high with headboards for reclining and cushions stuffed with wool. Tonight the couches are empty, the low trapezi tucked underneath them, the room waiting. But the olive oil lamp on its small stand is ready to be lit, and when it is, the mosaic floor will catch the warm amber light, and the room will feel for a few hours like something more than what it is. A modest room in a modest house, dressed in its best, receiving the evening. The furniture throughout the house is sparse but well made. In the upper rooms, chests with gabled lids, carved from olive wood, their surfaces rubbed with oil until they gleam, hold the household's clothing, the folded chitons and hematia, the wool wraps dyed in the natural tones of undyed fiber or tinted faintly with the russet of madder root. A klysmos chair stands against the wall of the main upper room, its curved back and splayed legs as graceful as any piece in the house, the wood bent and shaped by a craftsman's steam and patience. A diphros, a simple 4-legged stool, sits near the loom in the courtyard, where the weaver rests between passes of the shuttle. These are the furnishings of a life lived close to its materials, wood and wool and clay and stone, the substances of the earth shaped by human hands into the architecture of the ordinary. Nikon emerges from the upper floor, already dressed, already moving with the quick energy of a man whose day lies outside these walls. He eats standing, takes a fig from the clay dish on the kitchen ledge. He speaks briefly with Phanagora, a question about the grove, a detail about the baskets, and as he passes through the courtyard, his hand touches Thalia's shoulder, lightly, the gesture of a man already half departed. She looks up. Their eyes meet for a moment. Then he is past her and moving towards the door. Philon is already at the entrance. He is older than his son, but not yet old, a man whose body carries the compact strength of decades of grove work, shoulders shaped by the press beam, hands thickened by the millstone shaft. He pauses at the doorpost, and his hand rests briefly on the stone herm that stands there, a squared pillar topped with the head of Hermes, smooth from years of the same touch. It is a small gesture, nearly invisible, a prayer for safe passage, for safe return, offered to the god of travelers and thresholds, even for a journey that will take him no farther than the hillside grove. Beside the herm, facing the street with her 3 stone faces, stands the figure of Hecate, the goddess of crossroads and doorways, of the liminal space between inside and outside, between the known and the unknown. Her presence is a ward, a deflection, turning away from this threshold whatever malevolence the outside world might carry. Philon does not touch her figure. One does not touch Hecate, but his glance acknowledges her as he steps across the threshold, and for an instant the doorway holds both gestures, the warm touch to Hermes, the careful distance from Hecate, and then he is through, and Nikon follows, and the door closes behind them. The sound of their footsteps fades down the narrow street. The courtyard holds the silence they leave behind, which is not really silence at all. The fire crackles, the well rope creaks slightly in a breath of wind. Somewhere beyond the walls, a rooster announces what the household already knows. But the quality of the space has changed. The air is different when it holds only the 3 women, as though the courtyard itself has adjusted, settled more deeply into a register that belongs to the hours between the men's departure and their return. The loom stands under its cloth cover near the courtyard's eastern wall, waiting. The sorted wool, carded and ready for spinning, sits in a shallow basket beside it. The storeroom is open, the pithoi waiting to be checked. Phanagora surveys the courtyard with the practiced eye of a woman who has managed this space since she was a bride of 17. Longer than Thalia has been alive, longer than Nikon can remember, longer than the olive tree in the corner of the courtyard has been bearing fruit. Every surface, every vessel, every shadow in this space is known to her. She turns toward the loom, begins to lift the cloth cover, and the day's interior work begins. Let us follow them, out through the narrow street where the morning is still assembling itself, where neighbors' doors are opening and the smell of other hearths drifts from other courtyards, where a donkey shifts its weight against a tethering post, and a cat watches from a low wall with the absolute stillness that cats have always possessed. The settlement of Acharnai wakes in layers, household by household, each one a small world turning inward around its own fire, its own altar, its own rhythm of bread and prayer. But the streets between those worlds are filling now with the traffic of the harvest season, men carrying poles and baskets, a boy leading a mule loaded with empty sacks, 2 women walking toward the well with clay hydriae balanced on their shoulders, the vessel's wide mouths open to the sky. Philon and Nikon move through this current without hurrying. They carry the tools of the day's work, the long olive poles, smooth from years of handling, their ends slightly curved from the repetitive flex of striking branches, wicker baskets stacked and nested inside one another, light enough to carry, empty but strong enough to hold the weight of fruit, coarse nets rolled and slung over Nikon's shoulder, their hemp weave stiff with last year's oil stains. Their path angles upward almost immediately. Acharnai sits where the Attic plain begins to rise toward the lower slopes of Mount Parnes, and the olive groves occupy the transitional ground between the settlement's walls and the wilder country above. The landscape opens as they climb. Behind them and below, the plain stretches south and east toward Athens, its surface patterned with farmland. The stubble of harvested grain fields, the dark geometry of vineyard rows, the occasional gleam of standing water in an irrigation channel. On clear mornings like this one, the sea is visible as a pale line at the horizon's edge, more a suggestion of light than a body of water, and the air carries its faint saline tang even this far inland, mixing with the dry sweetness of autumn grasses and the first cool exhalations of the mountain forests above. The sky is enormous. It is the kind of sky that makes the landscape feel both vast and intimate, the way only autumn light can, sharp-edged, golden, throwing long shadows from every stone and tree trunk, making each thing more distinctly itself. And then the olives begin. They do not begin dramatically. There is no gate, no formal boundary. The groves emerge from the landscape the way they have always emerged, a few trees scattered among the scrub, then more, then the scrub receding and the trees thickening until the hillside is silver green with them, their narrow leaves catching the morning light and turning it to a pale, restless shimmer. Olive trees do not stand still, even on windless days. Their leaves are dark on one side and pale on the other, and even the smallest movement of air sets them flickering so that a grove in sunlight appears to breathe, a slow vegetable respiration that makes the light itself seem alive. Philon's grove occupies a stretch of the middle slope, perhaps 60 trees on rocky, well-drained ground. He knows them the way Phanagra knows her storeroom, individually, by character, by history. This one was planted by his father and has been producing for 60 years, its trunk twisted into a shape that looks like pain, but is simply age, its bark fissured so deeply that small insects make their homes in the crevices. That one, younger, was planted by Philon himself in the year of Nikon's birth, a gesture of faith in the future that has now begun to justify itself. The tree produced its first serious crop 2 seasons ago. The one at the grove's eastern edge splits into 3 trunks from a single root crown and has always yielded unevenly, lavish in its bearing year, and nearly barren in the off year, as though its generosity exhausts it completely. Every olive tree in Attica bears within it, in the understanding of the farmers who tend them, a lineage that runs back to a single, original tree. The story is not something Philon recites or even consciously recalls as he walks among his grove. It is more fundamental than that. It is the way he understands what an olive tree is. When Athena and Poseidon contested for the patronage of the city, each bringing a gift to King Cecrops on the Acropolis, Poseidon struck the rock with his trident and salt water burst forth. Impressive, powerful, useless for drinking. Athena knelt, planted a branch, and from the stone of the Acropolis grew the first olive. The city chose her gift. The city chose the tree. And from that original Moria, 12 sacred olives were transplanted to the grove of the hero Academos, and from those 12, the groves of Attica descended, or so the farmers understand it, in the way that one understands the things that have always been true, that were true before you were born, and will be true after you are gone. The sacred moriae are protected by law, inspected monthly by appointed officials, their damage or removal punishable by banishment and the confiscation of everything one owns. Philon's trees are not moriae, but they exist within the same understanding, under the same sky, rooted in the same rocky Attic soil. When he lays his hand against the bark of the old tree his father planted, he is touching something that connects, through root and story and the long patience of cultivation, to the goddess's original act. He does not think this in words. He thinks it in the way his hands move when they reach the first branch. The work begins. Nikon spreads the nets beneath the trees, unrolling the coarse hemp over the rocky ground, weighting the edges with stones where the slope threatens to pull them downhill. The nets are stained from years of use, their weave darkened with the residue of pressed olives, and they carry a faint, sweet, rancid smell that is the ghost of every previous harvest they have caught. Philon begins with the lower branches, working by hand. His fingers move through the silvery leaves with a combing motion, not grasping, not pulling, but coaxing, persuading the fruit to release. The olives are cool to the touch, firm, their skins taut and slightly waxy. Some are still green, hard, bright, the size of the last joint of a finger. Others have begun to darken, their color deepening from green through a bruised violet toward the final black of full ripeness. Philon picks selectively, the way a man reads a text he has read many times, his attention both automatic and precise. The greenest olives go into one basket. These will be pressed first, yielding less oil but finer, pale gold green and sharp with a peppery bite, the oil that Phanagora will use for the hearth altar and the household gods. The darker fruit goes into a second basket. These will yield more volume, a richer and heavier oil, good for cooking, for lamps, for the body's daily needs. Nikon takes the higher branches. He sets the carved trunk ladder against the old tree, a simple thing, a section of trunk with steps hacked into it at intervals, rough but stable, and climbs until he is above the canopy, the landscape opening around him in every direction. From here, he can see the rooftops of Acharnai below, the blue distance of the plain, the other groves along the hillside where neighboring families are already at work at their own trees, their movements small and rhythmic among the silver leaves. He takes the long pole and begins tapping the higher branches, not striking them, not beating them, but a measured, patient percussion, just enough force to persuade the olives to fall. They drop onto the nets below with a soft, irregular pattering, like the first uncertain drops of rain, each one a small dark impact against the pale hemp. The sound is quiet and continuous, punctuated by the occasional heavier thud of a cluster releasing all at once, and underneath it the ambient sounds of the hillside, the calls between neighboring groves, a woman's voice carrying from somewhere below, the dry rustle of wind through olive leaves, the distant braying of a donkey on the path. The work is slow, it is meant to be slow. Olives bruise easily, and bruised fruit makes bitter oil, so every gesture, the combing hand, the tapping pole, is calibrated to gentleness. The harvest cannot be rushed any more than the trees themselves can be rushed. An olive tree produces a full crop only every other year, pouring its energy into abundance and then resting, recovering, gathering strength for the next cycle. This is a bearing year for Philon's grove, and the trees have been generous. The branches are heavy, the nets filling steadily, the baskets accumulating with a satisfying weight. But even in a good year, the work takes days. You harvest a tree and move to the next. You fill baskets and carry them down and come back and fill them again. The rhythm is meditative, almost hypnotic. Reach, comb, drop, reach again. And the hours pass not in minutes, but in baskets, in trees completed, in the slow migration of sunlight across the grove floor. Other families are visible along the hillside, each at their own trees, their own nets, their own baskets. The olive harvest is a solitary labor conducted in company. Each family works its own grove, but the groves adjoin, and voices carry in the clear autumn air, and the communal character of the season expresses itself not in shared labor, but in shared timing, shared rhythm, the knowledge that everyone on this hillside is engaged in the same ancient work at the same ancient moment of the year. Children help at the edges of family groves, gathering fallen olives from outside the nets, carrying water to their parents. An old woman sits beneath her tree on a low stool, sorting directly from the ground, her hands moving with the unhurried certainty of someone who began this work before most of the people on this hillside were born. A neighbor's donkey stands on the path, loaded with full baskets, waiting with the absolute patience of donkeys for someone to lead it down to the press. And higher up, above the olive line, where the cultivated slope gives way to the scrubland and the scrubland yields to the dark skirts of the pine and oak forests that clothe Parnes, a thin thread of smoke rises against the morning sky. It is pale, almost white, curling upward from somewhere among the trees with the slow deliberation of smoke that comes from a carefully managed fire rather than a wild one. Philon notices it, the way one notices a familiar thing, the way one notices that the well rope needs replacing, or that the courtyard fig tree is dropping its leaves. He knows what it is. The charcoal burners are working. The mountain has its own harvest, its own seasonal labor, its own patient transformation of raw material into something the settlement below depends upon. The smoke rises, thins, dissolves into the enormous sky. The baskets fill. Nikon climbs down from the ladder, his arms aching, olive dust on his face and in his hair, and begins gathering the nets, funneling their catch into the wicker baskets with careful hands. Philon watches him work, not correcting, not instructing, but watching with the particular attention of a man who is seeing his own knowledge take shape in another person's body. Nikon is strong and willing and quick. He does not yet have his father's eye for the fruit, the instinctive assessment of ripeness, the feeling in the fingers that distinguishes the olive that will yield fine oil from the one that will yield merely adequate oil. That knowledge lives in the hands, and the hands learn it only through years, through seasons, through the slow accumulation of harvests that eventually becomes understanding. It cannot be taught by explanation. It can only be demonstrated season after season until the son's hands begin to know what the father's hands have always known. The first baskets are full enough. Nikon lifts them, two, one balanced in each arm, and begins the walk down the slope toward the press area, his steps careful on the rocky path, the baskets heavy against his body. Philon watches him go, then turns back to the next tree, lays his hand against its bark for a moment, the rough, fissured surface warm where the sun has reached it, cool in the deep crevices, and begins again. Reach, comb, drop. The olives fall, the nets receive them. The morning deepens toward noon, and the grove holds its patient, shimmering, silver-green light, and the work continues. While the grove has held its patient labor on the hillside, the house below has been conducting its own. Let us return to the courtyard, where the morning has been measured not in baskets filled, but in threads drawn, in grain ground, in the steady, quiet industry of women whose work rarely leaves the walls that contain it. The loom stands near the eastern edge of the courtyard, positioned where the light falls longest. It is an upright frame of smooth-worn oak, taller than Phanagora herself. and from its crossbar the warp threads hang in vertical lines, each one weighted at the bottom by a small clay disc. A loom weight pierced through its center and threaded onto the yarn. There are dozens of these weights, and when the weaver works, they shift and sway with each pass of the shuttle, producing a sound that is the most constant percussion of the Greek household, a rhythmic, muted clacking, like the tapping of many small fingers against clay. It is a sound so familiar that it disappears into the texture of the day, noticed only in its absence. When the loom is silent, the house feels strangely still. Phanagora works at this loom with the fluency of a woman who has woven since girlhood. Her hands move without apparent thought, the shuttle passing through the warp, the beater pressing the weft into place, the weights swaying and settling, the shuttle returning. The cloth emerging from the lower edge of the frame is a dense, even wool, undyed, the natural cream gray of the fleece. It is plain work, competent and consistent, the kind of cloth that will become a chiton or a himation, folded and pinned and belted into the simple rectangles that dress every member of the household. All clothing begins here, at this loom, in this courtyard. There is no shop, no market stall for everyday garments. The wool was sheared in spring, washed and carded and spun through the summer months, and now, in autumn, it is being woven into the fabric that will warm the household through the winter. Phanagora manages this entire cycle, from the raw fleece to the finished cloth, and she has, over the years, expanded the household's output beyond what the family requires. The surplus goes to market. It is not a large enterprise, and it is the kind of household industry that wealthier citizens look down upon, a thing beneath the dignity of a proper oikos. But it is income, and Phanagora does not concern herself with the opinions of households that do not need the extra drachmae. Beside her, a few paces away, Thalia works at a smaller frame, a portable loom propped against the courtyard wall. She is weaving a narrower piece, perhaps a belt or a decorative band, and her hands move with a different rhythm than Phanagora's. She learned to weave in her father's house from her own mother, and the techniques she absorbed there are nearly identical to what is practiced here. The loom is the same, the materials the same, the basic motions the same. But the details differ in ways that only a weaver's hands can feel. Thalia sets her warp tension slightly differently. The threads spaced a hair's width closer together, producing a fabric with a fractionally tighter weave and a subtly different texture under the fingers. It is not wrong. It is simply the way her mother did it, which is the way her mother's mother did it. A lineage of hands, teaching hands across generations. Phanagora notices. She notices everything about the cloth produced under her roof. It is her domain, the way the grove is phylons, the way the press is phylons, the way the storeroom with its sunken pithoi and its careful inventory is hers. She does not comment on Thalia's tension. She continues her own work, her shuttle moving at its accustomed pace, her cloth emerging with its accustomed evenness. But later, when Thalia rises to fetch water from the courtyard well, when her back is turned and her hands are occupied with the rope and the clay vessel, Phanagora sets down her own shuttle, crosses the few steps to Thalia's frame, and adjusts. Her fingers find the warp threads and ease them, almost imperceptibly, into the spacing she prefers, a small shift, a quarter breath of difference in the tension. She returns to her own loom before Thalia comes back. When Thalia resumes her weaving, her hands register the change immediately. The resistance is different. The shuttle moves through the warp with a fractionally altered feel, the way a familiar path feels different when someone has moved a stone. She pauses, not long, not dramatically, a pause that could be attributed to adjusting her grip or finding her place in the pattern. Her eyes move briefly to Phanagora's back. Then her hands resume. She weaves at the new tension. The cloth that emerges will be indistinguishable from Phanagora's. Neither woman speaks of it. The loom weights click and sway. The two rhythms continue, parallel and proximate, the sound of the household's textile industry filling the courtyard like a quiet, persistent heartbeat. Thrata, meanwhile, has moved from the loom area to the kitchen. The midday meal is a modest thing. There is no elaborate cooking, no long preparation. She sets out what is available. Radishes pulled from the small kitchen garden behind the storeroom, their green tops still attached. A handful of dried figs, dark and sticky sweet. A piece of hard white cheese that she cuts into rough portions on a worn wooden surface. Bread left from the morning's baking, torn rather than sliced. She arranges these on coarse clay plates, the everyday pottery, undecorated, functional, the kind that chips and cracks and is replaced without sentiment. Beside the food, she places a small lekithos, a narrow-necked vessel, its clay body smooth and cool, and from it she pours a thin stream of olive oil over the cheese and the bread. The oil catches the midday light as it falls, pale gold, almost translucent. It is last year's oil. This year's pressing has not yet begun. The first baskets of sorted olives are still days away from the trapetum. Every drop of oil used now comes from the reserves in the storeroom, measured and accounted for in Phanagora's careful economy. The oil's fragrance rises from the plate, a faint, grassy richness, mellowed by the year of storage, but still distinctly present. It mingles with the dry sweetness of the figs and the sharper mineral smell of the cheese and the green freshness of the radish tops. These are the smells of the midday hour, layered over the deeper, more permanent sense of the house itself. The wool and lanolin smell of the loom, the lingering charcoal from the morning hearth, the cold stone earthiness of the storeroom, the faint residue of olive oil that permeates every surface, every vessel, every cloth in a household where oil is fuel and food and sacrament in one. They eat in the courtyard near the loom without ceremony. Phanagora tears bread and dips it in oil. Thalia eats a fig, then another. Thrata sits slightly apart, eating from her own plate, the same food, portioned from the same supply, but consumed at the edge of the group rather than its center. The hierarchy of the household is visible even in the arrangement of bodies at rest. Phanagora nearest the hearth, Thalia in the middle ground, Thrata at the periphery. It is not cruelty, it is architecture. The architecture of a world in which some people belong to the household and other people belong to the household in a different sense entirely, and the distinction is written into every meal, every sleeping arrangement, every moment of shared labor. Nikon's arrival interrupts the quiet. He comes through the courtyard door with two baskets balanced against his body, his arms dusty to the elbows, the earthy smell of the grove entering with him like a companion. He sets the baskets down near the storeroom wall. More olives from the morning's harvest, dark and matte and fragrant, their skins faintly dusty with the fine powder of Attic soil. The courtyard's smell shifts with their arrival. the green, sharp scent of fresh olives layering over the mellower tones of the household's interior. Thalia brings him water in a clay cup and bread wrapped in cloth. He drinks, eats standing, speaks briefly of the grove. The trees are yielding well, the nets are holding, his father is still working the upper rows. His presence in the courtyard is transient, a passage between one labor and another. He touches Thalia's arm as he passes, a brief contact, the gesture of a man whose attention is already returning to the hillside. Then he is gone, and the courtyard door closes, and the interior quiet resumes. It is Thalia who makes the midday offering. She tears a piece of bread, the same bread they have all been eating, and carries it to the hearth. The fire has been fed through the morning, banked low for the warmth that cooking requires, and it glows rather than flames, the coals orange and pulsing beneath their gray ash. She kneels, she holds the bread above the coals, and she hesitates. The hesitation is small, a breath's duration, perhaps less. It is the pause of a woman whose hands know one set of words, and whose new household speaks another. In her father's house, the midday offering was made with a specific gesture, a specific murmur, the bread broken in a specific way before it was given to the flame. Here, in Phanagora's house, the gesture is nearly identical, but not quite. The bread is torn rather than broken. The murmur is pitched differently, addressed with a slightly different formulation. The same goddess, the same fire, but the texture of the prayer shaped by a different family's generations of practice. Thalia has watched Phanagora make this offering 100 times since her marriage. She has memorized the motions, but memorization is not yet habit, and habit is not yet faith. And in the small space between watching and doing, the body remembers what it learned first. She drops the bread into the coals. It catches, browns, blackens, becomes smoke. The offering rises. Hestia receives it as she receives all offering, silently, completely, through the medium of fire that is her body and her presence. Whether the bread was torn or broken, whether the prayer was murmured in this family's cadence or that one's, the fire does not distinguish. But Thalia feels the difference in her own hands. And the feeling is a kind of loneliness that has no name in any language she knows, a displacement she could not explain even if the language held the words for it. She rises, she returns to the loom. The weights resume their clicking. Across the courtyard, Phanagora's shuttle moves through the warp, steady and unhesitating, and the cloth grows by another fraction of an inch. And the afternoon stretches ahead, warm and quiet, and filled with the patient, repetitive industry that is the interior life of the house. The olives wait in their baskets by the storeroom wall, dark and glossy and fragrant, breathing their slow fermentation into the courtyard air. They are beginning their own transformation now, the sugars in their flesh shifting, the cell walls softening, the fruit preparing itself for the pressure that will release what it holds inside. In a few days, when enough baskets have accumulated and the sorting is done, they will go to the press. But for now they sit in the autumn light, and their scent mingles with the wool smell of the loom and the bread smoke of the offering, and the 100 other layered fragrances that compose the invisible architecture of this house. And the afternoon deepens, and the women's hands continue their work, and the courtyard holds its quiet, industrious, unhurried peace. A few days pass. The rhythm of the house has shifted in the way that harvest always shifts it. The courtyard, which for most of the year belongs to the loom and the mortar and the slow domestic round, has become a staging ground. Baskets of olives line the wall near the storeroom, 7 of them now, then 9, then 12, as Philon and Nikon continue their work in the grove each day. The baskets breathe. That is the only word for it. The olives inside them are alive with a slow chemical patience, their flesh softening, their sugars turning, their fragrance thickening into something richer and darker than the bright green scent they carried when they first came down from the hill. The courtyard smells different now, layered, earthy, faintly sweet, as if the season itself has moved indoors and settled among the familiar domestic odors of wool and charcoal and stone. Before the olives can go to the press, they must be sorted. This is not a task that can be rushed or delegated to inattention. The quality of the oil depends on what goes into the crushing basin. Green olives separated from dark bruised fruit set aside, leaves and twigs, and the small hard stems removed by hand, 1 olive at a time, thousands of olives over the course of a morning. It is work that belongs to the hands and the eyes, and in this household it belongs to the women. Phanagora spreads the sorting cloths in the courtyard after the morning bread has been baked and the offering made. The cloths are old, washed many times, their weave loose and soft from years of use. She arranges them in the best light, near the center of the courtyard where the autumn sun, still warm at mid-morning, falls unobstructed. Then she upends the first basket onto the cloth, and the olives tumble out in a dark, fragrant cascade, rolling and settling against one another, trailing leaves and dust and the faint, sticky residue of their own fermentation. She begins immediately. Her hands move through the olives with a speed that comes not from hurry, but from certainty. The fingers know what they are looking for. The small green ones, still firm, their skins tight and waxy. These go into a clay bowl on her left. They will be pressed first, separately, to produce the finest oil, pale and sharp and almost luminous. The darker olives, purple-black and yielding to the touch, go into a larger bowl on her right. Good oil, more of it, but heavier, less refined. The damaged ones, split skins, bruised flesh, the telltale softness of insect damage, are set aside in a third vessel. They will not be wasted. Even damaged olives yield something: oil for lamps, for leather treatment, for the dozen practical uses that are not worthy of the table or the altar, but are necessary nonetheless. Leaves and stems she sweeps to the edge of the cloth in quick, practiced gestures, barely looking down. Thalia settles across from her on the opposite side of the cloth and begins her own sorting. Her hands are slower, not uncertain. She knows the difference between a sound olive and a damaged one. She grew up among olive trees, but less automatic, more visual. She picks up each olive individually, turns it, examines it, places it in the correct bowl. Where Phanagora's sorting is a continuous motion, a river of small decisions flowing without pause, Thalia's is a sequence of discrete judgments, each one considered, each one correct but separate from the next. The difference is the difference between 37 harvests and 5, between a body that has internalized the work and a mind that is still learning to trust itself. Thrata works between them. She takes her place at the sorting cloth without being told where to sit. The space between the two women, close enough to reach either set of bowls, positioned where her own rhythm can serve as a bridge between the two different speeds of work happening on either side of her. She does this without comment, perhaps without conscious intention. Her hands find their pace, not as fast as Phanagora's, not as deliberate as Thalia's, but somewhere in the middle, a tempo that Thalia can hear and follow without strain. The three women's hands move over the sorting cloth, and gradually, without discussion or instruction, the two slower rhythms converge into something like unison, while Phanagora works at her own pace on the other side, her sorting bowls filling visibly faster. Let us notice the details that histories rarely record. The feel of the olives under the fingers, cool at first from the night air still held in the baskets, then warming as the sun reaches the cloth. The waxy smoothness of an unblemished skin. The slight give when the flesh beneath has softened with fermentation, not rot, not damage, but readiness. The fruit becoming willing to release what it holds. The faint pop of a stem detaching cleanly. The stickiness that accumulates on the fingertips and in the creases of the palms, a residue of oil and pigment that will darken the women's hands over the course of the morning until their fingers look as though they have been dipped in ink. Olive oil is lipophile. It clings to skin, sinks into it, becomes part of it. By afternoon, the staining will have reached the wrists and the smell. Close to the cloth, hands deep in the olives, the fragrance is almost overwhelming. Not unpleasant, but dense, complex, layered. The green olives smell sharp, herbaceous, faintly bitter, like crushed leaves. The dark ones smell sweeter, earthier, with a richness that is almost animal. Beneath both runs the base note of fermentation, warm, yeasty, alive. It mingles with the other scents of the courtyard, the wool on the loom that stands idle this morning, its cover removed so that the sorting cloths could be spread where the light falls best, the residual smoke from the hearth, the cold stone of the well, the dry, sweet breath of the fig tree that grows against the courtyard's southern wall, its branches nearly bare now, a few late leaves still clinging and curling at the edges. It is into this scene of quiet, concentrated labor that Eugenia arrives. She comes through the courtyard gate without announcement, which is itself a statement about the nature of harvest season and the nature of 30 years of neighboring. During the olive harvest, the boundaries between households become permeable. Families who share a press share labor, share meals, share the sorting and the carrying and the long hours of communal work that the season requires. Eugenia has sorted olives in this courtyard many times, and Phanagora has sorted in hers. The gate is not locked during harvest. The knock is not expected. She moves carefully. 74 years have compressed her frame, drawn her shoulders inward, slowed the pace that was once, by all evidence, as brisk and certain as Phanagora's is now. She carries a small cloth bundle, figs perhaps, or cheese, the customary small contribution a visitor brings to a working household. She sets it near the sorting cloth without mentioning it and lowers herself to the ground with the deliberate concentration of someone negotiating with joints that no longer cooperate automatically. Once seated, her hands find the olives immediately. The body remembers what the body has always done. Her fingers begin their sorting, slower than Phanagora's, steadier than Thalia's, with the unhurried assurance of a woman who has performed this exact task for 60 harvests and could do it with her eyes closed. Phanagora greets her with a word, a nod. The greeting is correct, sufficient, and no warmer than it needs to be. Eugenia returns it with the same measured courtesy. These two women have known each other for more than 3 decades, since the day Phanagora entered Philon's household as a young bride and found Eugenia already established in the neighboring house, already the senior woman of the shared press arrangement, already the one who knew how things were done. Their familiarity is not the same as intimacy. It is the familiarity of adjacent lives lived in parallel, of 1,000 small negotiations over shared resources, whose olives go to the press first, how the cost of a new millstone is divided, whether the pressing schedule accommodates one family's earlier harvest or the other's larger yield. These negotiations have been conducted over the years with varying degrees of grace, and the accumulated residue of them lies in the careful distance between the two women's bodies as they sit at the same sorting cloth, working toward the same purpose, side by side but not quite together. Eugenia's eyes move as she works, not restlessly, with the quiet, habitual surveillance of a woman who managed a household for 50 years and has not entirely stopped managing it in her mind, even now that the authority has passed to her son's wife, even now that her hands sort olives in someone else's courtyard because her own hands are no longer fast enough to keep pace with the press schedule. She watches Phanagora's sorting, the speed, the precision, the unhesitating confidence of each placement, and there is recognition in her gaze, the recognition of one master of domestic labor observing another. She watches Thalia, the younger woman's careful attention, her considered pace, her quiet competence that has not yet become fluency, and something softens almost imperceptibly in the lines around her mouth. She watches Thrata, the subtle adjustment of rhythm, the bridging tempo, the unspoken accommodation, and her expression does not change, but her hands pause for a moment, the briefest interruption in 60 years of sorting, before they resume. Nikon comes down from the grove with another pair of baskets. He sets them near the storeroom wall, drinks water from the well, exchanges a word with his father about the trees. As he passes through the courtyard, Eugenia's gaze follows the baskets, follows them with a particular quality of attention, counting, weighing, estimating. How many baskets today? How many total? What the yield will be when the pressing is done? It is the arithmetic of the household manager, the perpetual inventory that runs behind the eyes of every woman who has ever been responsible for knowing whether the stores will last through winter. It is the reflex she has not shed, the skill that served her household for half a century. And it is the same skill that operates with identical precision and somewhat less gentleness behind Phanagora's eyes on the other side of the sorting cloth, counting the same baskets, performing the same calculations, arriving at the same numbers. The morning passes. The sorting bowls fill and are carried to the storeroom and replaced with empty ones. The baskets diminish, are emptied, are set aside. The women's hands grow dark with olive stain. The courtyard holds them in its warmth and light, 4 women working in a configuration as old as the harvest itself. The senior woman, the younger wife, the neighbor, the enslaved worker, their hands moving through the same fruit, their rhythms distinct but converging, their silences carrying the weight of everything that is understood between people who share labor without sharing the words for what they know about each other. By early afternoon, the sorted olives fill the storeroom bowls in their careful categories, the green, the dark, the damaged, each separated and ready. The finest green olives, The ones Phanagoras selected with such unhesitating precision will go to the press first. They are ready now. The fermentation is sufficient, the quality is high, and Philon will want to begin the first pressing tomorrow if the weather holds. The sorted fruit sits in its vessels in the cool storeroom darkness, and the work of transformation, the passage from raw harvest to sacred oil, is about to begin in earnest. Eugenia rises slowly, accepting Thalia's offered hand without comment. She gathers her cloth bundle, which has been sitting untouched near the sorting area. She forgot it or left it intentionally, a small gift of figs that the household will find when the cloths are folded. She makes her way to the gate, pausing there for a moment to look back at the courtyard, the loom standing in the corner, the sorting cloths still spread in the light, the three women beginning to gather the bowls and carry them inward. Then she steps through the gate and is gone, back to her own courtyard, her own diminished authority, her own hearth, where a daughter-in-law tends the fire now and makes the offerings in her own way. The sorted olives wait in their clay bowls in the storeroom. Tomorrow the baskets will go to the press. Let us follow them there, down the path from the house, past the courtyard wall, to the stone and timber structure near the grove where Philon is already preparing the trapetum, checking the millstones, testing the weight of the beam, readying himself for the work that will turn the dark, patient fruit into something the Greeks have always understood as more than nourishment, as light, as medicine, as the medium through which the mortal and the divine communicate, one golden drop at a time. The press area stands where it has stood for longer than Philon can remember, longer perhaps than his father could remember before him. It occupies a leveled clearing among the lower groves, a space where the rocky ground was cut and flattened by hands now anonymous, and where the stone basin of the trapetum sits as though it grew from the hillside itself. The structure around it is modest, timber upright supporting a tile roof that shelters the press from rain but leaves the sides open to the air, so that the work happens half indoors and half out, in the shifting light of a late autumn morning. The floor is packed earth-stained dark with decades of oil. The smell of the place is permanent, a deep, layered scent of pressed fruit and stone and old wood, the kind of smell that has seeped so thoroughly into its surroundings that it would persist even if no olive were ever crushed here again. Philon arrives before anyone else. He comes in the gray pre-dawn, the same hour his wife tends the hearth, though his work takes him in the opposite direction, outward, uphill, toward this clearing that is his domain the way the courtyard is hers. He moves through the space with the same unconscious surety Phanagoras shows in the dark rooms of the house. His hands know the equipment the way her hands know the pithoi and the altar and the loom. He runs his fingers along the rim of the mortarium, the great stone basin hollowed to a smooth concavity, checking for cracks. He inspects the malarium, the short stone column fixed in the basin's center, around which the two hemispherical millstones will rotate. The millstones are called trochoi, heavy enough that two men must lift them into position. The wooden shaft, the cope, runs through the column and extends outward on both sides, each end yoked to a millstone. And at the heart of this mechanism, where the shaft meets the column, an iron pin, the polos, holds everything aligned. Philon tests it by feel, turning the shaft slightly, listening to the faint grate of iron on stone. A loose polos means uneven crushing. A cracked millstone means bitter oil. The difference between fine oil and coarse oil begins here, in these small assessments that precede the first olive entering the basin. He is satisfied. He turns to the beam press, a long timber lever, its thick end anchored to the wall of the structure, its free end hanging over a stone pressing platform. The weight that will supply the pressure sits nearby, a massive, roughly shaped stone pierced through the center, which can be hung from the beam's end by a rope threaded through the hole. Additional stones can be added for successive pressings. The pressing cloths are draped over a rack beside the platform, coarsely woven, sturdy enough to hold pulp under steady pressure without tearing, though Philon inspects each one and sets aside two that show wear. Below the platform, a shallow clay basin collects whatever liquid seeps through. Beside it, a sequence of larger settling basins waits, fired clay set into the ground, where the oil and vegetable water will separate by patience and gravity, helped by gentle warmth. Nikon appears as the light reaches the clearing. He carries the first baskets of sorted olives from the house, the green fruit that Phanagora and Eugenia selected yesterday, the ones that will yield the finest oil. He sets them down near the trapetum and looks to his father. Philon nods toward the shaft. Nikon takes his position. The crushing begins. Nikon grips the cope and walks. His circuit is slow and steady, a pace dictated not by his strength, but by the process. The millstones must roll over the olives deliberately, their weight doing the work rather than speed. The trochoi rotate around the central column, passing over the olives pooled in the basin's curve. The sound is deep and particular, a low, continuous grinding, stone on stone with the wet, fibrous yielding of olive flesh between them. There is no other sound quite like it. It fills the clearing, a resonant hum felt as much in the chest as heard by the ear, underscored by the slow rhythm of Nikon's footsteps as he circles. Philon watches the pulp. This is where his expertise resides, not in the effort of turning, but in the reading of the crush. The millstones must break the olive flesh thoroughly, releasing the oil trapped within the cells, but the pits, the hard, woody stones at the center of each olive, must remain mostly intact. Shattered pits release a bitter compound into the oil, a flavor that no amount of settling will remove. Philon reaches into the basin periodically, lifting a handful of pulp, pressing it between his fingers, examining the fragments of pit mixed through the purple-green mass. When he sees too many splinters, he tells Nikon to ease back, to lift the shaft slightly so the trochoi ride higher. When the flesh is still too coarse, he lets the weight settle again. The adjustment is constant, attentive, a conversation between the pressman and the material that no one else at the clearing can quite follow. Nikon turns the shaft. Philon reads the pulp. Between them, the olives are reduced to a dense, fragrant paste. The smell intensifies as the crushing proceeds. Fresh olive pulp releases a scent unlike the finished oil. Rawer, greener, almost sharp, with a grassy bitterness that catches at the throat. It mixes with the older, mellower smell of the press itself and with the cold mineral scent of the stone basin. The clearing fills with it, and the air seems to thicken with the oily richness of a substance that is not yet oil, but is on its way to becoming it. When Philon is satisfied with the crush, the pulp is transferred to the pressing platform. He and Nikon work together now, spooning the heavy paste onto the first pressing cloth, spreading it evenly, folding the cloth over, laying another cloth on top, spreading more pulp, folding again, building a layered stack of cloth and olive paste that will be compressed under the beam. The work is slow and deliberate. Philon's hands are unhurried. Each layer must be even. An uneven load presses unevenly, forcing solids through the cloth into the oil below. He takes care. Nikon mirrors his father's movements, matching his pace, learning through his hands what Philon has never explained in words. The particular weight of the pulp, the way it settles, the resistance of the cloth. The beam descends. Philon guides the weighted stone onto the lever's end, and the long timber arm presses down, slowly, steadily, with a patience that belongs to the mechanism rather than the man. There is no dramatic moment of compression. The pressure builds as gradually as daylight. And then, from the base of the stack, seeping through the cloth, running in a thin, unsteady stream into the clay basin below, the first oil emerges. It is a color that must be described carefully, because it is unlike any other liquid in the household. It is not the golden amber of last year's stored oil, nor the dark richness of oil that has stood in a pithos through the summer. First pressing oil from green olives is pale, a luminous gold with an undertone of green, almost translucent, catching the morning light in the basin below the press like something lit from within. The Greeks will use this oil on the altar of Hestia, in the lamps that burn before the household gods, as the anointing medium for a newborn's amphidromia, as the oil that is poured over the body of the dead. It is not merely culinary. It is the substance through which the sacred enters the material world, and its quality at this moment, fresh from the first pressing, before settling, before time and air begin to diminish it, is as close to the goddess's gift as the mortal process can produce. Philon skims the surface of the collecting basin with a shallow vessel, watching the pale oil separate from the darker vegetable water beneath it. Time does most of this work, and warmth helps. This is where Simos enters. He comes down from the upper slopes of Parnes, arriving at the press area as though he has timed his descent to this exact stage of the process, which in fact he has. Simos has been making charcoal on the mountain for all of the years that can be accounted for, and the thread of smoke visible above the tree line these past several days has been his kiln, a carefully constructed mound of hardwood, oak mostly, covered with earth and turf, burning slowly and airlessly for days while he tends it, managing the vents, reading the color of the smoke to judge the progress of the carbonization within. Now the burn is complete, and he leads a donkey loaded with sacks of finished charcoal down the mountain path to the press. The smell of him precedes his arrival. Wood smoke and carbon, sharp and acrid, a smell that has entered his skin and clothing so thoroughly that it is no longer something he carries, but something he is. His hands are dark, his tunic darker, and the fine black dust of the charcoal sifts from the sacks as the donkey picks its way down the slope. He is a quiet man, with the stillness particular to people who spend long stretches alone in the forest, tending slow fires and listening to the mountain. His craft is essential and invisible. Without charcoal, the braziers and cooking fires of the settlement go cold. The potters' kilns do not reach temperature. The metal workers cannot smelt. And here at the press, the charcoal fuels the low fire beneath the settling basins, a gentle, steady heat that warms the oil and water mixture just enough to help the two liquids separate more completely. Too much heat and the oil degrades. Too little and the separation is slow and incomplete. The fire must be patient, which is why Philon values Simos's charcoal. Hardwood charcoal burns evenly, without the sudden flares and collapses of softer fuel. Simos unloads the sacks and builds the fire with the same quiet attention he gives to everything. He does not need Philon's direction. The two men have collaborated at this press for years, their crafts intersecting at this single point, heat and oil. Simos feeds the charcoal into the fire pit beneath the settling basins, adjusting the airflow with a clay damper, reading the fire the way Philon reads the pulp. Philon nods. The basins warm, the oil rises. By mid-morning, the press area has become a gathering place. Other families arrive through the morning, carrying their own sorted olives in baskets, waiting for their turn at the trapetum, helping with the communal labor of loading and turning and pressing. Children sit at the clearing's edge, watching the grinding circuit of the millstones. An old man from a neighboring household inspects the first oil in the settling basin and offers his assessment to no one in particular. A woman brings a cloth-wrapped bundle of bread and cheese for the workers. The conversation is practical, seasonal, familiar. Whose trees bore well this year and whose bore poorly in the biennial rhythm, how the late rains affected the fruit, whether the oil will be plentiful enough for both the household lamps and the surplus for market. The press is the grove's agora, a place where economic and social life converge around the shared act of transformation, where the private labor of individual households becomes, for these few weeks, a communal enterprise. Through it all, Philon tends the process. He checks the settling basins, skimming oil into clean amphorae with the same shallow vessel, pouring carefully, watching the line where gold-green oil meets the brownish water beneath. The vegetable water, the lees, collects in a separate basin. It will not be wasted. The families will use it for waterproofing, for leather treatment, for fertilizing the groves themselves, for keeping insects from the storerooms. The spent pulp, too, has its uses. Dried into cakes, it can fuel fires through the winter. Nothing from the press is discarded. The olive enters whole and leaves as oil, as fuel, as fertilizer, as medicine, as light. The transformation is total. Late in the day, Phanagoras comes. She does not come for the social gathering. She comes for the oil. She arrives at the press carrying a clay amphora, not one of the large transport vessels, but a smaller household jar, carefully cleaned, its interior rubbed smooth. She sets it down near the settling basins and watches Philon work for a moment. The quality of her attention is unmistakable, appraising, knowledgeable, specific. She has been receiving oil from this press for 37 years. She knows what good first-pressing oil looks like in the basin, its color, its clarity, the way it moves when the surface is disturbed. She knows what it should smell like, bright and green and slightly peppery, with none of the heaviness or rancidity that signal poor handling. Philon fills her amphora. He pours slowly, letting the oil run in a thin, steady stream, keeping the sediment undisturbed. Phanagoras holds the vessel, tilting it slightly to receive the oil at the correct angle. Their hands are close but do not touch. The gesture is practiced. They have done this together at this press, at this time of year, for longer than Nikon and Thalia have been alive. It is a partnership made visible in a small, unremarkable act of transfer. The oil passes from his domain to hers, from the press to the house, from the outdoor world of grove and stone and communal labor to the interior world of hearth and altar and lamp. She lifts the amphora, tests its weight, examines the oil's surface in the afternoon light. She is satisfied. She brings bread and water for Philon and Nikon, sets them on the stone ledge near the pressing platform, exchanges a few words about the yield. How many amphorae might the season produce? Enough for the household and for market both. Philon estimates. Phanagora calculates. Their conversation is brief, functional, and carries the weight of shared stewardship. Then she turns and walks back down the path toward the settlement, the amphora balanced against her hip, the first oil of the season traveling home. This vessel, this particular oil from this particular first pressing, will fill the household lamp tonight. It will be poured as a libation over the hearth fire. It will anoint the bread at the evening meal. It will be the oil that Phanagora keeps closest in the small lekathos beside the altar for the offerings that begin and end each day. It is the finest thing the household has produced, and it belongs now to the woman who will decide how every drop of it is used for cooking, for light, for the gods, for the market, for the careful daily maintenance of the covenant between a family and the powers that sustain them. The press continues its work as the afternoon deepens. Other families' olives are crushed, pressed, settled. Semos tends his fire, feeding it small measures of charcoal, keeping the temperature even as the day cools. Philon moves between the trapetum and the settling basins, reading the oil, adjusting the process. Nikon turns the shaft, carries baskets, hauls spent pulp to the drying rack. The clearing hums with the particular energy of seasonal labor, purposeful, communal, finite. In a few weeks, the pressing will be done, the last baskets emptied, the trapetum cleaned and covered for the winter. But today the work continues, and the oil flows, and the light slanting through the olive branches above the clearing falls in shifting patterns across the stone floor like something the grove itself is offering. The shadows lengthen. The families begin to gather their vessels and depart, carrying their oil home in amphorae and smaller jugs, following the paths back down through the groves toward the settlement. Semos dampens his fire, loads the remaining charcoal onto the donkey, and starts back toward the mountain. Though tonight he will sleep at a neighbor's house rather than climb all the way to his kiln in the dark. Nikon stretches, rolls his shoulders, wipes his hands on a cloth already dark with oil. Philon makes one final check of the settling basins, covers them with clay lids against the night air and the insects, and stands for a moment in the emptying clearing. The trapetum is still. The press beam hangs at rest. The air holds the scent of the day's work, rich, green, heavy, and beneath it the older, deeper smell of every pressing this place has ever known. He turns toward home. The path is familiar, worn smooth by years of walking between the grove and the house, between the work of the hill and the warmth of the hearth. The evening is settling over Acharnai, the sky deepening, the first coolness of autumn night touching the air, the sounds of the settlement rising gently from below, a dog, a closing gate, the distant voice of someone calling a child indoors. Philon walks slowly. He is tired in the way that satisfying work makes a person tired, not depleted, but completed, the body having done what the body knows how to do. Ahead of him, the settlement gathers itself for the evening, and the settlement gathers itself for evening, and somewhere within its walls, within his walls, the hearth is already burning. He can smell it before he reaches the door. Not the hearth itself, not yet, but the meal that the hearth has made possible. Lentils simmered low and slow, their earthy sweetness deepened by hours of patient heat. The sharper note of fish on a grill, the warm, yeasty presence of bread that has only recently come off the cooking stone. These scents carry through the narrow street and meet Philon at the corner, and his pace quickens without his deciding to quicken it, the way a body answers the call of home before the mind has finished forming the thought. He pauses at the door. His hand finds the herm of Hermes in the near dark, the small stone pillar with its rough-carved face, standing where it has stood since Philon's father placed it there. A murmured word of thanks, not for a safe journey, the walk from the press is barely half a mile, but for the day's work completed, the oil flowing clean, the grove's gift received. Then he pushes through the door and enters the courtyard, and the household closes around him like a hand. The fire in the hearth is strong. Phanagora has built it up for the evening cooking, and its light fills the courtyard with a warmth that is as much emotional as thermal. The amber glow reaching the walls, touching the loom's covered frame, catching the glaze on the row of storage jars visible through the storeroom doorway. The courtyard altar to Zeus Herkaios stands in its usual place near the fence, a modest stone structure that the firelight barely reaches. But the hearth, Hestia's hearth, is radiant. It is the center from which the evening radiates outward. Thrata has been working since mid-afternoon. The lentils, brown, ordinary, the staple legume that appears at the evening meal more often than any other dish, have been simmering in a wide-bellied ketra set directly over the coals. She has seasoned them with dried oregano and a measure of garum, the pungent fish sauce that the Greeks use the way later civilizations will use salt, as the invisible foundation beneath every savory dish. The lentils have broken down into a thick, fragrant mass, neither soup nor stew, but something between, what the Greeks call ethnos, a word that carries no elegance but describes what most people actually eat most nights of their lives. Beside the hearth, on a small clay brazier fed with charcoal, a piece of salt fish sizzles in a shallow teganon, a broad, flat cooking pan. The fish was soaked since morning to draw out the brine, then laid on the hot surface with a pour of olive oil, and now it curls and crisps at its edges, releasing a smell that is sharp, marine, and deeply savory. Thrata turns it once with a wooden spatula. Her movements are economical, unhurried, timed to the food's own pace rather than any external urgency. Thalia is beside her, cutting radishes on a flat stone. The knife, iron-bladed, wooden-handled, its edge maintained by Philon on the household's whetstone, passes through the radishes with clean, fibrous snaps. She arranges them on an earthenware plate alongside a block of white cheese and a small dish of brined olives. These are not this year's olives. Those are still sitting in baskets in the courtyard, waiting for the press, or already transformed into the oil that Phanagora carried home this afternoon. These table olives are from a previous autumn's harvest, stored in brine in a sealed pithos in the storeroom, their flavor deepened by months of salt and thyme into something rich and almost meaty. Thalia tastes one as she works. The brine stings her lips, and then the olive's dense, oily flesh gives way between her teeth, bitter and salt and fat all at once, the entire character of the fruit compressed into a single bite. Nikon arrives shortly after his father, smelling of the press, olive pulp and stone dust, and the particular sweetness of fresh oil that has soaked into his skin and his tunic both. He washes at the well in the courtyard, drawing the water up in a clay vessel and pouring it over his hands and arms. The water is cold. He cups some to his face, and the shock of it briefly erases the day's fatigue. Thalia brings him a cloth, and he dries his hands, and the gesture between them is small and ordinary, and carries the particular tenderness of small ordinary gestures. A cloth offered, a cloth accepted, the brief meeting of eyes that says you are here. The day is ending, we are home. Now the household gathers, all five of them, Phanagora, Philon, Nikon, Thalia, Thrata, are together in the courtyard for the first time since the morning's brief convergence at the door. The evening meal is the one meal of the day that the full household shares, and its gathering has a quality different from the fragmented rhythms of daytime, when the men are in the grove and the women in the courtyard, and the house divides itself along the ancient partition of exterior and interior labor. Here, at the hearth, the household reassembles. Here, for the duration of the meal, the oikos is whole. Phanagora makes the first offering. She lifts the oinocho, a plain terracotta pouring jug undecorated made for daily use, and fills a shallow phiale with wine. The wine is dark, resinous, mixed with water in the proportions that custom prescribes. Undiluted wine is for the gods themselves, or for those who have forgotten that they are mortal. Phanagora pours from the phial into the hearth fire. The wine hisses on the coals, sending up a brief column of fragrant steam, grape and resin, and the sharp mineral note of evaporating water. This is for Hestia, first and last, always. Then a portion of the lentils, a spoonful, ladled into the flames, a piece of the bread, broken and offered, the fish's first portion. Each offering disappears into the fire, consumed, transformed, sent upward as smoke and scent toward the goddess who dwells in the flame itself. The smoke rises through the courtyard and disperses into the autumn evening above the roofline, carrying with it the household's daily covenant. We fed you first, we remember. The fire is tended, the bond holds, then they eat. The food is set on a low trapeza, a portable table with 3 legs that stands barely knee-high, its surface worn smooth by years of use. They sit on stools, diffroi, simple 4-legged seats without backs, arranged around the table in the courtyard's warmth. The kleinai and the andron are for formal occasions, for the symposium, for entertaining guests. A family meal takes place here, close to the ground, close to the fire, close to each other. Bread serves as the primary utensil, torn into pieces, used to scoop the lentils, to sop up the oil that pools on the plate beneath the fish, to pinch the cheese and olives. The bread that has served as a napkin, wiped across fingers, pressed against oil-slicked lips, is torn into scraps and dropped to the ground when the meal is finished. There is a detail preserved in the folklore. Food that falls to the earth is not waste. It belongs to the heroes, the powerful dead who reside beneath the ground, whose hunger is ancient and whose claim on the scraps of the living is understood to be as real as any god's claim on the smoke of the altar. A Pythagorean saying warns against picking up fallen food, because it is theirs now. Phanagora would not frame it in those words, but neither does she reach for what has fallen. Wine follows the food. The kylakes, shallow 2-handled drinking cups, are filled from a mixing vessel where wine and water have already been combined. The cups are broad and shallow, designed for sipping rather than gulping, their wide surfaces catching the firelight. Philon drinks slowly. He speaks between sips of the pressing, which family's olives will go next, the condition of the beam, the quality of the first oil. His voice carries the unhurried satisfaction of a man reviewing work well done. The oil from the first pressing, he says, is excellent, pale, clean, with the peppery bite that marks the earliest green olives. It will be fine enough for the altar, for the lamps, for the body. Phanagora listens and asks a question. How many amphorae can they expect from this year's full harvest? She is calculating. She is always calculating. The household's supply for the year, the surplus that might go to market, the quantity reserved for lamps and offerings in the storeroom's great pithoi that must carry the family through to the next pressing season. She holds the household's economy in her head the way Philon holds the quality of the oil in his hands. Between them, the entire cycle of production and consumption is accounted for. Nikon adds his own observations, a branch that split under the weight of the fruit, a section of the grove where the trees bore less generously, the weather's effect on the ripening. Thalia listens. She eats her lentils, drinks her wine, watches the conversation move between father and son and mother with the attentive stillness of someone still learning the rhythms of a household she has married into, but not yet fully absorbed. She is not excluded. Nikon turns to her, includes her with a glance, a half smile, but the conversation's deep structure is older than she is. It flows along channels cut by decades of shared harvests, shared calculations, shared knowledge of these specific trees and this specific press and this specific storeroom. Thalia is mapping it. She files away the patterns the way she has been filing away the offering rituals and the loom tensions, not resisting, not yet contributing, but building the internal architecture that will one day allow her to move through this household the way Phanagora moves through it now, by memory rather than sight. Thrata eats last, as she does every night after the family has been served. She sits slightly apart, not excluded from the fire's warmth, but positioned at its margin, close enough to rise and refill a plate or pour more wine without being asked. Her meal is the same food, the same lentils, the same bread, the same oil. In this household, the enslaved woman eats what the family eats, which is not true of every household, and the family observes this without commentary. She eats quickly, efficiently, with the economy of someone whose rest is always contingent on the completion of other tasks. The cleaning will be hers, the plates and cups and cooking vessels, the courtyard swept, the fire banked for the night. But for now she eats, and the fire warms her face the same way it warms every face around it, because fire does not distinguish. The meal slows, the wine settles, the conversation thins to comfortable silence, the kind of quiet that comes not from having nothing to say, but from having said enough. Philon rises, stretches, and crosses the courtyard toward the Andron. Tonight it holds only him, no guests, no symposium, no formal entertainment. He eases himself onto a cline, the couch's woven surface giving slightly under his weight, the pillow headboard supporting his neck. A single olive oil lamp burns on a low stand beside the couch, its flame steady in the still air of the enclosed room. The light is warm, amber, soft-edged. It catches the mosaic pattern in the floor, colored pebbles set in geometric designs that shift and blur in the lamplight, their edges dissolving as the eye grows heavy. The walls are plastered and painted in horizontal bands, red below, pale yellow above, separated by a thin, incised line, and in the lamp's gentle light they seem to breathe, to soften, to recede. The oil in the lamp, last year's oil drawn from the same storeroom pythos that has fueled every evening's light since last harvest, burns with the faint, fatty, familiar scent that is as much a part of this house as the smell of the hearth itself. It is the smell of every evening Philon has ever spent in this room. He closes his eyes. The day settles into his body. The weight of the millstones turning, the careful pressure of the beam, the slow emergence of oil from pulp, and his breathing deepens, and the lamp burns on. In the courtyard, Thrata clears the last of the dishes. Phanagora sits by the hearth a moment longer, the phyla still in her hand from the final libation, the last offering to Hestia, mirroring the first, closing the circle of the meal. She pours the last drops of wine into the flames. The fire hisses, accepts, goes on burning. Then she sets the phial down and rises, and her gaze crosses the courtyard to where the amphora of first pressing oil stands against the storeroom wall, the one she carried home from the press this afternoon, its clay surface still cool to the touch, its contents settled and clear. Tomorrow this oil will be decanted, distributed, stored, but tonight it simply sits, full and still, holding within it the grove and the press and the labor of the day and the gift of the goddess, all transformed, all quiet, all waiting. Thalia and Nikon have already gone upstairs to the Gyneconitis. Their footsteps on the wooden stair are soft, receding. The courtyard empties. Thrata finishes her work and withdraws. The house draws inward, the way courtyard houses do, not closing against the world, but folding into itself, the blank exterior walls holding the warmth and the firelight and the smell of lentils and oil and wine within their perimeter, offering nothing to the street but silence. And the hearth burns on. It will burn all night, because it always burns all night, because to let Hestia's fire die is to break the oldest covenant the household knows. Phanagora has banked it carefully, coals drawn together, ash mounded over them, a slow combustion that will hold until morning, when she rises in the dark and kneels and rakes the coals and breathes the flame back to life, as she has done every morning for 37 years, as she will do tomorrow and the next day and the day after that, her bare feet finding the path to the hearth, the way hands find a familiar face in the dark. The evening deepens. The stars appear above the courtyard walls, one by one, then all at once, the autumn sky opening over Acharnai, over the groves on the hillside, over the still press clearing and the mountain where Simos's kiln sends its last thread of smoke into the dark. The air is cool now. Somewhere a gate latches. Somewhere an owl calls from the direction of the grove, its voice low and unhurried, traveling through the quiet the way sound travels through places that have given up the day's business and are holding only the night's. The house is still. The oil waits in its amphora. The fire waits in its coals. The olive harvest at Acharnai does not end in a single day or a single week. It continues, basket by basket, branch by branch, pressing by pressing, through the shortening days of autumn and into the early weeks of winter, when the last dark ripe olives are gathered from the highest branches and the final loads are brought down from the grove on Nikon's shoulders. The rhythm that began before dawn on the morning we arrived simply carries on, the way rhythms do when they are older than any single person who performs them. Let us stay a moment longer, here at the edge of the story, before the night deepens fully and the world of Acharnai passes beyond our reach. In the days that follow the evening we have just left, the press clearing continues its work. Other families bring their olives, baskets carried on donkeys, on shoulders, in the arms of children old enough to help. Philon receives them all with the same patient attention, examining the fruit, assessing the ripeness, directing the crush. The trapetum turns, the beam press descends. The oil runs in its thin, luminous stream into the settling basins, and the smell of fresh pressing, that green, peppery, grassy scent, saturates the air of the clearing and drifts downhill toward the settlement, mixing with the wood smoke and the bread smell and the thousand small domestic fragrances of a community going about its autumn work. The amphorae fill, one by one, sealed with clay stoppers and marked with a scratch or a daub of pigment to indicate the pressing. First, second, third. They are carried into storerooms and set against walls, their pointed bases nestled into the packed earth of the floor. In Phanagora's storeroom, the new oil takes its place beside the great sunken pithoi that hold the grain and the wine, and the household stores deepen toward winter. She counts. She has always counted. The measures of barley, the jars of brined table olives, the skeins of spun wool waiting on their pegs, the amphorae of oil with their scratched markings. The inventory is her authority, the ledger she keeps not on wax or clay, but in the sure architecture of her memory. She knows what the household has. She knows what it needs. She knows, within a narrow margin, what it can spare for market. And it is this, the surplus, that connects the household to the wider world beyond the courtyard walls. A portion of the oil, the cloth Phanagora has woven beyond the family's needs, perhaps a basket of the coarser late harvest olives. These will go to the agora in the weeks ahead, carried by Philon or Nikon to the market stalls where vendors call their prices and buyers finger the goods, and the whole noisy, sociable commerce of the polis unfolds under the open sky. The oil that Philon pressed and Phanagora stored will pass into other households, other lamps, other hearth offerings, other meals. It will anoint skin in the gymnasium, where some young man scrapes it away with a bronze strigil, and the mixture of sweat and oil is collected in a basin and sold, improbably, for its supposed healing properties. It will burn in a clay lamp beside a loom where another woman weaves, the flame steady and warm-scented, casting the same amber light that fills Phanagora's courtyard each evening. It will be poured, perhaps, into a small lekythos and placed in a grave, the smooth white vessel painted with quiet figures, the oil inside it a final offering for a journey no one fully understands but everyone prepares for, because the dead must be anointed, because the passage must be eased, because this is what olive oil has always been for, the substance that moves between the living and the divine, between the mortal body and whatever lies beyond it. The household does not know this. Phanagora does not think in these terms as she counts her amphorae. She thinks in terms of sufficiency, enough oil for the lamps through winter, enough for the altar, enough for cooking, enough to sell. The sacred and the practical are not separate categories in her mind. They never have been. The oil she poured into the hearth fire this morning, the first offering of the first pressing, that act was as practical as banking the coals and as sacred as any prayer spoken in any temple on the Acropolis. Hestia does not distinguish. The fire receives what it is given and burns. And Thalia, in the days and weeks that follow, Thalia continues to learn the particular grammar of this household. She learns where Phanagora keeps the lekythos of fine oil that is used only for offerings. She learns the specific words Phanagora murmurs when she pours the evening libation, words that are not quite the words Thalia's mother used, not quite the rhythm, not quite the intonation, but close enough that the gods, she hopes, hear the same prayer in both. She learns the tension of Phanagora's loom, and she adjusts her own weaving to match it, not because she has been told to, but because she has been watching, and her hands have understood what her pride has been slow to accept, that there is knowledge in this house she does not yet possess, and that the way to receive it is not to resist, but to attend. This does not happen all at once. It happens the way the olive ripens on the branch, slowly, imperceptibly, through the accumulation of days in which nothing dramatic occurs, but everything shifts by fractions. There will be mornings when Thalia arrives at the hearth before Phanagora and tends the fire herself, and Phanagora will come down to find the flame already burning and the barley already grinding, and she will pause, just for a breath, just for the space of a single heartbeat, and something in her will recognize the gesture for what it is. Not a challenge, not a displacement, a continuation. The fire that Phanagora has tended for 37 years will, in time, be tended by other hands, and the goddess who lives in the flame will not notice the change, because the flame is the same flame, and the offering is the same offering, and the covenant between hearth and household does not depend on any single pair of hands, but on the unbroken intention to keep it burning. But that is later. That is the story continuing beyond the edges of what we can see from here. For now, for this evening, this night, this quiet autumn dark over Acharnai, the household rests. Phanagora sleeps near the hearth, as she always does, her breathing slow and even, the banked coals warming the air around her with their faint, steady glow. Phelon sleeps in the andron, stretched out on the cline with its linen cover and its pillow headboard, the olive oil lamp extinguished now, only the smell of it remaining, that warm, familiar, slightly fatty sweetness that has scented every room he has ever slept in. Nikon and Thalia sleep upstairs in the gynaeconitis, where the wooden shutters are open to the autumn air, and the stars are visible through the small, high window. Not many, just a handful framed by the mud brick wall, but enough to know the sky is clear and tomorrow will be fine for the grove. Thrata sleeps where Thrata sleeps, in the corner that is hers. On the pallet she rolls out each night and rolls away each morning, her rest the rest of someone whose labor begins before anyone else's and ends after, the grinding stone and the kitchen fire and the washing up all finished, the house put right, the morning already approaching in the way that mornings do, not as an event but as a certainty, as reliable as the coals in the hearth, as the oil in the amphora, as the turning of the millstone in the trapetum when the sun comes up and the work begins again. The grove on the hillside holds its trees in the dark. The olive branches move faintly in the night breeze, that dry, silver-leafed rustling that sounds like nothing else, like a whisper passed from tree to tree across the slope. The nets are folded and stacked at the edge of the clearing. The press is still, the beam raised, the stone basin empty and scrubbed, waiting for tomorrow's fruit. Higher up, on the flank of Parnes, Simos's kiln has cooled. The charcoal inside it will be ready in a day or two, hard, light, clean burning, the mountain's wood transformed by patient fire into the fuel that will heat the settling vats and the kitchen hearths and the workshop braziers of the settlement below. The thread of smoke that rose from the kiln all day has thinned to nothing. The mountain is dark, and at the crossroads, the place where the path from the grove meets the road to the settlement, where three ways converge in the dust, a small clay dish sits at the base of a rough stone pillar. Someone has left a meal there, a piece of barley bread, a fig, a drizzle of honey darkening in the cool air. This is the dipnon, the offering to Hecate, laid at the crossroads on the month's last night for the goddess of thresholds and the restless dead who travel in her wake. By morning the food will be gone, taken by the goddess, or by the hungry poor who know these crossroads and their offerings, or by both, which may amount to the same thing. The dish will remain empty until someone retrieves it. The offering has been made. The boundary between the household and the night, between the known and the unknown, between the living and the dead, has been acknowledged with bread and honey and the small, persistent faith that such acknowledgments matter. You do not need to remember all of this. You do not need to hold the names or the details or the specific arrangement of the loom weights on their threads. What you might carry with you, if anything, as the story fades and the night around you becomes simply your own night in your own room, in your own quiet corner of the world. What you might carry is the sense of it, the warmth of a fire that someone tends, the smell of oil in a clay lamp, the sound of stone on stone in a kitchen before dawn, steady and unhurried, the rhythm of a household that has found its way through another day and will find its way through the next one, the knowledge, quiet, bone deep, older than any single life, that the simplest acts of care are also the most enduring, that bread broken and offered to the fire is a conversation with something larger than yourself, that the hands that sort the olives and turn the millstone and weave the cloth and bank the coals are performing in their ordinary way the same work the gods are said to do, Athena at her loom, Hephaestus at his forge, Hestia in her eternal unextinguished flame,